While everyone's been drooling over Resident Evil 2 Remake and Kingdom Hearts 3, I've been busy playing an indie game, Y2K A Postmodern RPG. Y2K attempts to distinguish itself from most games stylistically with a strong effort in art and music design, while its gameplay mechanics represent a return to a tried and true method for approaching game design. The best way I know how to describe this game is almost bordering on the verge of paradox. One moment it feels strangely familiar, while other moments feel uniquely different from any experience I've had in games before. It was kind of like discovering an alien spaceship while finding myself completely able to drive it flawlessly from the very beginning. A multi-layered complex story only adds to the inertia and reminded me of something a person would experience during a whacked out psychedelic trip. There were high highs and low lows, and that is the reason that this review is titled the way it is. I found there to be so many issues with the game, yet I still find myself wanting to recommend it because for $20, you get your money's worth. We're entering spoiler territory now, people. I won't be spoiling the story in depth, but there will be elements of the presentation, gameplay, and story on the screen, so you've been warned. With that, let's jump into a cosmic conundrum, my review of Y2K, a postmodern RPG. Perhaps the most praise I can put forth to Y2K is the fact that its presentation is dynamite in just about every way possible. The story starts out in a small, unassuming town that seems like any other before ballooning into crossovers between that and otherworldly dimensions, as well as the deep inner workings of a person's psyche. You are constantly traveling back and forth between these normal and weird settings, and it keeps the world always feeling fresh, as well as keeping you on your toes, as you can never predict what kind of locale you'll be in next. But the art design keeps it all cohesive enough, as incredibly varied locations still feel connected within the game's world and story. I struggle to even come up with words to describe this game's art style, as it's so different from anything I've ever seen before. It feels handcrafted, as if the world was made out of construction paper with a ton of help from scissors and glue. The closest thing I've played that I can probably compare it to would have to be Tearaway Unfolded. Even character movements look almost glitched out, as walking animations purposefully skip frames to aid that otherworldly but familiar feeling that the game is trying to invoke from you. What I'm struggling to say here is that the game's art design is top-notch, it's brilliant, it's unique, and it always kept me wanting to see more. The game is trippy. It's a word that's almost unavoidable to use when talking about Y2K because it fits so perfectly. The game takes place during 1999, and with the approach of the new millennium, tensions are high as internet culture begins to grow and a pervasive sense of distrust for established thinking patterns permeates throughout pockets of society. I'll go over this more in the story section, but the game turns down a very cosmic path very quickly, and so you'll be hopping back and forth between townships that are littered with 90s cultural references and locations deep in the soul space that exist between realities. Yeah, it's trippy. I guess this is the part where I acknowledge how much this game is inspired by Earthbound, although I really haven't played that game, but I do see it pop up all over the place when I do research on this game, so take that how you will. In terms of music, we have another slam dunk. The game's soundtrack is one of the best I've heard in a long time, the battle music especially. It starts out a bit slow, but builds up quickly into epic pieces as battles rage on, although sometimes battles run a little bit too long and the music loops over and over, but if the music's good, so what? I've never been someone who would buy a game's OST, but I wouldn't be surprised to see many people throwing money for this one. While music was a big highlight, the voice acting though was kind of the opposite, and I really didn't love any of the characters' voices outside of Vela and Claudio, And to put that into perspective, that's only 2 characters out of a group of 8 main heroes and a bunch of other voice side characters. In terms of more technical aspects of the presentation, we have some issues that need to be addressed. Load times were somewhat of an issue for me, even when playing on PS4 Pro. It's not that load times take too long, it's just that there were so many times when a load screen is needed. Between cutscenes, loading into combat, loading out of combat, and moving between the many areas, especially within the dungeons. I felt like I was seeing load screens a bit too frequently, and it seemed to eat up more time than I would have liked it to. Also, this game has released with some other bug issues. 2 times during my playthrough, the game froze while attempting to load up the next dialogue box, and in turn, this led me to lose 3 total hours of progress because the game doesn't have an autosave system. I understand this game is inspired by 90s culture and games from that era, but there is absolutely no reason to not include the amenities afforded to it by being made in the late 2010s. I can't fathom why the game didn't include an autosave feature, especially considering how many bugs, some of which are seemingly game-breaking, are still part of the game at launch. That led to a lot of frustration, so if you do play this game, save often. All in all though, the presentation and atmosphere of the game were top-notch and always kept me guessing, which kept me engaged and entertained. So turning to the gameplay now, Y2K is a turn-based RPG at heart when you strip away the psychedelic paint. That means you can expect your fair share of strategic combat, leveling up, and traveling all over the world map. Said map is actually pretty expansive all things considered and represents another callback to games past. There is a giant overworld map that you use to travel between different areas, and once you reach these smaller hub areas, you're free to walk around them and interact with items, shops, and people. There are a few towns and other areas to explore, and you can also find monster dungeons on the overworld map in case you feel the need to grind up some experience before your next main mission. The overworld map itself is cumbersome though, as roads and train tracks can't be crossed at just any location. Instead, you have to find crosswalks to travel to the other side, and it can make traveling very annoying. It's much easier to just use the bus fast travel feature once you unlock each area instead of trying to travel by foot. Within the different town areas and dungeons, there are puzzles to solve in order to progress the story or find hidden items. I found most of the puzzles to be pretty straightforward, but some were a little annoying, although in hindsight, that's pretty refreshing considering most games today just hold your hand the entire time and walk you through step by step. This game isn't afraid to make you think a bit, but it won't send you into any hellish rage quits with its puzzle design. The game also offers some side questing, but they are very much off the beaten path and pretty simple in design, aka get this item and bring it to this guy, or collect a bunch of things. I really didn't find them to be worthwhile. Although I'm pretty sure you need to do one of them to reach the secret ending, although that isn't confirmed. I just think it would make sense. In terms of dungeon design, I'll say the game does a fairly good job with them, as they get more complex as the game goes on, and each of them offers new challenges without throwing them at you too quickly. However, I was surprised to see that at least a few dungeons didn't end with any real boss fight. That was kind of disappointing. You just get to the end, and it's like, oh, cutscene, you're done. I was like, oh, no boss? And finally, before we talk about combat, I briefly want to talk about the leveling up system, because I'm not really sure what they were thinking when designing it how they did. So as you fight, you gain experience points, and for every 100 points you get, you can level up 3 to 4 different stats just a little bit. You do this by entering the mine dungeon. The setup of this area is not explained well at all. Basically, you see 4 doors with numbers over them. You enter the room, pick either HP, Strength, Defense, Luck, PP, or Speed to level up, and then re-enter the room to get that stat increase. You can also find doors down here that allow you to learn new skills. But basically, they took a very simple concept in leveling up stats and made it complex in a bad way. It doesn't take you too long to figure it out for yourself, but it will leave you scratching your head as it goes from confusing to straight up time consuming. That's because every time you want to level up, you have to locate a save point in the game, load into the mine dungeon hub, load into the mine dungeon itself, enter each room twice, unlock the next level of the dungeon to continue leveling, and then have to go through 2 load screens just to get back to the main world. It's utterly ridiculous, but I think that's all I want to talk about in terms of non-combat gameplay, so now let's look at the meat of your experience, the turn-based combat. Unfortunately, this is where I have to bring up the major issue that I personally had with the game that I just kind of alluded to, and that would be issues with pacing. And I realize how subjective that is, but the slow pacing of gameplay and story affected my perception of the game, and I think it's only fair that I mention it here. If you play a lot of turn-based RPGs, I think you'll be able to tolerate it better than me. However, I don't think you can argue that the game's combat doesn't get tedious. Before we get into that though, let's set up what the combat looks like. So combat is a turn-based system where your party of 4 takes on another party of enemies, which can contain up to 5 foes. At least that's the most I remember seeing at one time. As you play through the game, you unlock new party members to fight with. They each have unique attacks and skills that can be used strategically in battle, and you have plenty of items you can use as well, and it's all kind of pretty standard for this genre. Where the game tries to differentiate its combat is in how you attack. You have to engage in mini-games that are focused on building up combos to do more damage on your enemies. For example, Michael, a photographer, must do a QTE where he presses a corresponding button when it's in position. The more times he is able to do this successfully, the higher combo he will get, and the more damage he can do to an enemy. Dodging attacks is also minigame based, where most of the time you are given a chance to either defend and take minimal damage, dodge completely, or if you mess up, take full damage from your enemy. A lot of these minigames are just quick time events and they can take up to 10 seconds each to complete, which doesn't sound like much, but it adds up very quickly and can bog down the pacing. I found my eyes to be overly strained too because of having to focus so hard on completing so many QTEs as efficiently as possible in order to kill enemies. They do try to keep these minigames fresh by doling out new ones in the form of playable characters and also by expanding your combo potential, but for me, these changes felt artificial and weren't different enough to stop the growing sensation of tediousness in me as the game went on. Another factor that doesn't aid this combat system is the fact that enemy variety is extremely poor. You will find yourself fighting the same old enemies over and over again for most of the game, and very few of them challenge you in any sort of interesting way. It seemed to me that 95% of the enemies in the game had health bars just big enough to annoy you, but used the same couple moves over and over again. A single attack, a double attack, a full party attack, or a heal. And honestly, that's about all your party does as well. Most of the special abilities are about attacking, and even though there are a lot of skills for characters to learn, most of them boil down to do more damage. The biggest challenge the game can throw at you for most of the battles in the game is an artificial one: enemies with big health bars. It can make some of these battles go on for way too long, upwards of 15 minutes, sometimes even more than that. In the end, this combination of tedious minigames and unengaging enemy design that doesn't challenge you leaves the combat system feeling simplistic at best and boring at worst. Its only saving grace was that they included a fast forward button that you can use to skip through animations at any point in combat. It's safe to say I use that button a lot. Combat starts out interesting enough, but you quickly realize how thin the veil truly is, and it becomes more of a slog where sometimes you will actively attempt to avoid combat altogether if you're just trying to finish up a dungeon. All in all, the gameplay suffers from a pacing issue, at least it did for me. It broke up the sections between gameplay and story quite nicely, but I can't help but feel this game's total playtime was ballooned by slowing down an already simplistic design. It's not awful by any stretch, and there is some enjoyment to be had, but don't expect much in terms of engaging you with interesting mechanics. And that brings us to what I imagine will be the factor that makes it or breaks it for most players: the story. A lot of the time in reviews I do full story recaps, but I'm going to get away from that this year. So the story of this game reminds me a lot of the movie Inception. It can be hard to follow and is constantly taking it up a notch in order to keep you engaged. However, the constant shifting will piss off a lot of people. I'm trying to be as vague as possible here, but suffice it to say that you'll either appreciate the game's weird twists, or you will be thoroughly disappointed by the game's conclusion. For me, I enjoyed where the story went, and it left me with an overall good impression of the game. But by reading what some other players are saying on Reddit, the story ultimately left them with a bad taste in their mouth. So, take that how you will. You will primarily be playing as a young man named Alex, who doesn't get any brownie points from me just because we look eerily similar. I ain't ready to show you all this ugly mug yet, but suffice it to say, Alex and I do have some pretty similar features. Anyway, enough of the Lost Twin drama talk. Alex is a recent college graduate who has returned home to his small town, where he quickly discovers some strange things are going on. He follows a cat into an abandoned factory where he meets an odd young woman named Sammy Park. After conversing with the girl for a bit, Alex is horrified when she is suddenly sucked into another dimension by a cosmic creature made up of stars. And this begins Alex's quest to find Sammy, as he feels a deep connection to her despite their short interaction. Along the way, Alex meets up with friends new and old who have had similar galactic experiences who share his passion for the supernatural. The friends learn of metaphysical beings, a soul space where souls go to be free from our bodies, and about mind dungeons that hold a person's psyche. In the game's final hours, what was already a strange tale cranks itself up to 11 with a plot twist that will leave players amazed or angry depending on their perspective. I'd say the reaction to that twist is what will ultimately either brighten or tarnish a player's perception of Y2K A Postmodern RPG. I think that's all I want to say about the actual plot of the game, but I do want to talk about the characters and writing a bit. So, I already mentioned that the game's biggest issue is probably pacing, and the story sections don't help alleviate this problem either. Some conversations between characters can go on for so long and seemingly be so pointless.
Kids should pay closer attention to your record jackets. They have lots of useful information on them.
Alex himself is hyper detailed in explaining his thoughts, feelings, and reactions instead of just showing them to me. Maybe that was one limitation of the game's art design, but I'm sure they could have came up with something better than winded and sometimes pretentious speeches. Dialogue parts can go on forever and are rarely more than expositional bits trying to catch the player up on the more complex themes and ideas being presented in the story. In other words, the game spends a lot of time explaining itself and its characters. When looking at characters, Alex himself isn't very likable, honestly. He's full of himself and doesn't always consider the emotions or feelings of other people when engaging with them. I'm not saying that he's an awful protagonist or really hard to play as, but he does come off as unlikable a few times throughout the game, but given the game's overall story, I get it, and I don't have a ton of issues with it. I'd say most of the other characters are simplistic as well. Each is defined by like one positive attribute and one negative attribute. If I had to choose my favorite character, I'd probably say Claudio because of how genuine a character he seemed to be. The game story will take you on a wild ride, but it's no roller coaster in terms of speed. It's more of a merry-go-round. Information is doled out to you in just enough time before you stop playing from pacing or repetition issues. So, I fear that this review may have sounded more negative than I initially intended, but I think it's time to answer this cosmic conundrum and share my final thoughts. So, overall, I liked Y2K A Postmodern RPG, but man did it frustrate the hell out of me sometimes. From losing hours of progress when the game froze on 2 separate occasions, to the overall slow pace of gameplay and story, I almost stopped playing this game a few times, but I'm glad I didn't, and it was because the art design and the story did just enough to keep me wanting to see what would happen next. The combat though was pretty average, but I'm glad I continued to play. I can really only recommend this game though if you're a big fan of turn-based RPGs or like stories that continuously get more complex and ask you new questions. I think my opinion on this game would be a lot more glowing if it had been a 12-hour playthrough instead of a 20-hour playthrough. Y2K, a postmodern RPG, suffers from poor pacing and repetitive gameplay, but the style, the 90s nostalgia, the thought-provoking questions about reality, and the timeless lesson of the power of friendship will carry you through to the end. So that concludes my review for Y2K, a postmodern RPG. Honestly, I can't believe I just spent weeks playing an indie game that will garner very little attention or interest for the channel, considering games as big as the Resi 2 Remake and Kingdom Hearts 3 are out now. But oh well, I liked making this video, I liked playing the game, and you know, I just can't wait for the 7 views this video will get over this calendar year. In other news, I'm in the process of making a Twitter for the channel that you guys can follow for video updates and my thoughts on the video game industry. I figured it could be another place to chat. Unfortunately, the account is currently suspended because Twitter thought it was a spam account because I haven't done anything with it yet. Once that's resolved, feel free to follow me at NopNapNarp. I'll probably make another video announcing it once I get it fully solved, but for now, just keep that in mind. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Consider subscribing for more. And as always, have a nice day and take care.